So welcome to this webinar on expanding civic space in decision-making in the water and sanitation sector. My name is Virginia Roth. I am a senior advisor to Sanitation and Water for All. My focus is on human rights, the elimination of inequalities, and financing to reach the SDGs. Before we start, I'd just like to give you some of the housekeeping reminders. We have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. So please select your language of choice. There's a button down on the bottom right-hand side of your screen of a globe. You just need to click on that for the language that you want to be listening in. My colleagues have also pasted the French and Spanish version of the PowerPoint in the chat so that you can listen to the simultaneous interpretation and open the French or Spanish slides on your own laptop so that you can better understand and follow the presentations. Please do add your name, organization, and country in the chat box if you're comfortable to do so. And if you have any technical issues at all, please feel free to message in either our Zoom hosts or the co-host for support. So with the housekeeping out of the way, firstly, I just need to say how extremely glad I am to be introducing this CIVICUS End Water Poverty, Sanitation and Water for All exchange. This webinar has been in discussion for a while, and I know that those who have been working to make it happen are pleased to have got to this point, and we really seem to have hit a nerve, as we have so many people who have registered to join us today. Just very quickly, before I start with the first presentation, I just want to thank our partners in this endeavor, End Water Poverty and Civicus. End Water Poverty is a long-term partner of Sanitation and Water for All, and we've worked often together with them. Civicus, we have been, as I say, in discussion with for a long time, and I think this is the first time we've had a global webinar together with Civicus. We really appreciate this interest in water and sanitation from an organization that works on so many other issues. And we like to take it as an indicator of the importance of water and sanitation for civil society. It also provides us as Sanitation and Water for All to look beyond water and sanitation, to hear other perspectives and to respond to some of the discussions that are happening in the not in the delivery of water and sanitation space, but more in the activist space, such as we're doing here, the question of how to work in a world where civic space is under threat. So maybe I will start by introducing the agenda. We move on a slide. So I am going to start. We will start by having framing of what civic participation in the human rights framework looks like. I will start by discussing the human rights framework and the role that civil society plays in ensuring the realization of the human rights to water and sanitation. Then Anjali will talk about how Anjali Kapoor from Sanitation and Water for All will talk about strengthening civic participation through collective action. And Alana Potter from End Water Poverty will talk about how the rights claiming strategies are improving access to services. So that will be 20 minutes of presentations. We will then go into the partner exchange between SWA, EWP, and Civicus members. We have 50 minutes for that, and you will be in breakout rooms, and we will clarify how that happens after the presentations. And then at the end, there will be a 10-minute wrap-up just to bring together all of the lessons that we're learning from this session. I think we can just go straight ahead and in order not to lose too much time, because we do have a lot to get through. So I am just going to talk very briefly about the human rights framework and the role of civil society. I have been working with the human rights to water and sanitation for, I can say now, over 20 years, since the general comment number 15 was agreed at in 2002. So I will just talk you through some of the key aspects of the human rights framework on the human rights to water and sanitation. Many of you probably know a lot of this already, but I hope it'll be a useful reminder. Next slide. So firstly, water and sanitation are internationally recognized human rights, and all 193 countries in the world have essentially agreed that water and sanitation are human rights. How do we know this? So firstly, we know this through the series of resolutions that have gone through the General Assembly and through the Human Rights Council. And on the right here of the slide, you can see a screenshot of a website that shows you which countries have agreed to which of the human rights resolutions. And on this, so I hope you will all get copies of these slides. Otherwise, we will make sure that you get the link to this very useful website, which was created by Make Rights Real, because you can look up your own country and see which of the resolutions which of the resolutions your country has agreed to. And there's only 4 countries in the world that have not specifically agreed to the human rights to water and sanitation. And I think that's a really important fact to recognize. And I also just want to clarify that means everybody who lives within the borders of a country has access, must be able to enjoy those rights. It's not just citizens, it's everybody. So I just want to make that very clear, because there's often confusion about whether it's only citizens have their human rights. So moving on to the next slide. Just to make also very clear that the human rights to water and sanitation are clearly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, the human rights to water and sanitation are one of the only rights which are specifically mentioned in the 2030 Development Agenda. And obviously it informs Goal 6 on water and sanitation. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, what does it mean? What is the definition of the human right to water? Firstly, so I'm just going to tell you that the pure definitions which we use with human rights. So the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. Next slide. And the definition of the human right to sanitation clarifies that sanitation is a system for the collection, transport, treatment, and disposal or reuse of human excreta and associated hygiene. Next. Which states must ensure without discrimination that everyone has physical and economic access to sanitation in all spheres of life, which is safe, hygienic, secure, socially and culturally acceptable, and provides privacy and ensures dignity. So just to be very clear there, that sanitation is not just about the toilet, but it's about from use of a toilet to treating the fecal sludge or the fecal waste. Thank you. Next slide. So just very briefly, what you will have seen contained in those definitions of the right to water and the right to sanitation, there are 5 normative criteria, which are availability, quality, affordability, acceptability, and accessibility, which clarifies that you do not have access to water if you cannot afford to pay for it. You don't have access to water if the quality is not good. Access to your right to water, I should say. Next slide. And so why are the human rights to water and sanitation important? So what I really appreciate about the human rights is it's stopped people thinking that providing water and sanitation is a gift. It's not, it's charity. Next. The other thing that I find really useful to understand about human rights is that they're not only an end, but they're a means to an end. So what I will talk about in the next slide is about the principles, so the processes of achieving rights. It's a process, it's a never-ending process. You don't achieve your rights and then you're protected and you have them forever. It's a constant process of using those principles to ensure continued access to water and sanitation. And in that sense, human rights are a tool to achieving human rights. It's a strange circle that actually both the rights are an end, but they're also this means to an end, and they're a tool to achieve human rights. Next point. Human rights are obviously relevant in every country in the world. And one of the things that we learned, particularly when I was working with the UN Special Rapporteurs on the human rights to water and sanitation, that there is not a country in the world where everybody can enjoy their human right to water and sanitation. So they are highly relevant in every country in the world, and there are challenges everywhere in the world. Next. And finally, as I said already, I think that they give some dramatic weight to the SDGs because they clarify what is contained in those SDGs. Next point. So these are the tools that we can use. These are the principles that define how the rights to water and sanitation can be implemented. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. I think you're already aware of many of them. So there's access to information. There has to be access to information that is relevant to people when they're accessing the water and sanitation. They must be delivered without discrimination and aiming to eliminate inequalities. There has to be accountability. States must be able to be held to account for achieving their rights. Participation, which is the subject of this particular meeting. It means that people need to be able to participate in decisions around how they access water and sanitation. The human rights to water and sanitation must be sustainable. We must be able to ensure that everybody continues to have access to water and sanitation, even in times of, as we are experiencing at the moment, great political change, climate change, and obviously the extremely difficult time that we're just coming through about COVID. And then there's another principle, which is about maximum available resources and financing. States need to be able to demonstrate that they are using the maximum of resources available to them to ensure that people are able to access water and sanitation. And SWA has been doing some work on that. We're very happy to share that with you after this meeting. So we're going to zoom in on participation in this discussion, and participation must be embedded in national legal frameworks and safeguarding the right to active, free and meaningful participation. There must be as much clarity as possible in how participation is ensured in the process of deciding how water and sanitation are to be delivered. And it means that governments must develop the right programs and policies to include all the affected people, particularly, obviously, disadvantaged, marginalized, vulnerable groups and individuals who may need extra support in being able to participate. Next. So we're going to hear about some examples of increasing participation from our civil society partners. And there are many different ways of ensuring participation in service provision, from community scorecards to mapping who has access to water and sanitation and who doesn't, to report cards which allow people to report on how public services are being delivered and whether there's satisfaction. There are accountability days, there's opportunities for planning and budgeting and monitoring budgeting, and there's also direct action tactics such as sit-ins and litigation. And we're going to be talking about all of these different opportunities today. Next. So there are also advocacy tool checklists that can be used for people who are engaging in this issue, and we will be happy to share those checklists with you as well. Particularly those coming out of the first Special Rapporteurs, Catharina d'Albuquerque's handbook on the human rights to water and sanitation. So we'll be very happy to share that with you too. I think that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to pass on to Angela. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Next slide, please, Sam. Perfect. Hello, everyone. I am Anjani Kapoor from Sanitation and Water for All, which is a United Nations hosted global multi-stakeholder partnership. Next slide, please. We have an advocacy objective at SWA of mobilizing the heads of state, championing national multi-stakeholder approaches, and system strengthening by putting human rights to water and sanitation at the heart of our messaging and advocacy. SWA Civil Society constituency is the largest in the partnership, with over 230 civil society organizations and networks who are our partners. SWA works with civil society partners to bring forward the voices of the most marginalized in decision-making processes in water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. This includes advocacy for civil society to be part of the decision making and also via engagement in public policies and financial allocations, and also holding governments and others accountable for increasing access to services. Therefore, the partnership and the civil society constituency with SWA lean more towards the collective action side. Next slide, please. At the national level, this advocacy plays out through multi-stakeholder engagement, which can take different forms, as you can see on the slide. For instance, SWA CSO partners are engaged in multi-stakeholder processes like joint sector review, or JSR in short. Now, a joint sector review is a government-led periodic process which brings together different stakeholders, including civil society, to review progress and performance of the sector. This helps in taking joint decisions on priority actions. Joint sector reviews, you can think about them as invited spaces for CSOs, and they're crucial in our sector because it is not just a meeting, rather it's a process that involves both a preparatory phase and a period of follow-up to ensure decisions are translated into action. Then there are multi-stakeholder platforms like technical working groups in the ministries or intersectoral coordination platforms that have been set up by various line ministries. However, in some countries, we have seen that these multi-stakeholder platforms are often given to INGOs that are involved in service delivery. Now, on the right-hand side of this continuum and diagram, you can see that there are multi-stakeholder partnerships like us, SWA, or Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, or Open Government Partnership. Now, these partnerships can also kickstart multi-stakeholder initiatives in the country. For example, there is an SWA committee in Mali and an SWA task force in Malawi, which are good case studies for us of the multi-stakeholder collaboration at the country level. And in many cases, SWA civil society partners have been instrumental in pushing for these initiatives. Next slide, please. So to further deepen our partnership's understanding to open spaces for civil society and other non-government actors, could you go back to the, thanks Sam. So just as I was saying, to further our understanding on opening spaces for civil society and other non-government actors via multi-stakeholder engagement, we have undertaken research both globally and at the national level. One example you can see as the screenshot on your slide, on the slide. Some of the observations from our research work and conversations with SWA CSO partners, I have summarized those conversations as 4 broad learnings, as you can see on your screen. First, our CSO partners are moving away from more traditional service delivery role to rights-based advocacy. Now, this shift helps in reframing the participation as obligation of the government, as mentioned by Virginia earlier. So instead of the narrative of governments creating these opportunities for CSOs, the tactic that has been used, for instance, by CSOs in Kenya, is to mobilize governments to focus on their obligation. Now, this tactic is, of course, met with resistance in some countries where civic spaces are not open and funding for advocacy is negligent, such as with our partners in Nicaragua and Mexico, or in countries wherein the humanitarian and the development nexus is not strong. Second trend that we have seen is when CSO networks or organizations present a common voice from civil society during joint sector reviews or other national coordination platforms, it is better heard and received. So coalition building as a strategy is a success indicator when it comes to multi-stakeholder engagement nationally. For example, in Malawi, Sierra Leone, Zambia, and Peru. But where these coalitions or common voice is missing, either INGO participation is prioritized or multiple messages and demands create friction and competition. Third trend is around wanting to influence alternate entry points of influence. And for SWA, it's our development partners. However, depending on the mandate and funding outlook of the partner, we have received mixed response on this, especially in Latin America. However, when alternate entry points were tried by CSOs in Nigeria with the donor group in the country, it was better received. Lastly, before handing over to Alana, I also want to share learnings from our partners in Uganda, Ghana, Liberia, Bangladesh, and many others that say that evidence speaks better during national multi-stakeholder processes. And for building evidence, I think a lot of methods of choice were also listed in Virginia's presentation on participation. But you'll hear more about these specific experiences in the breakout rooms. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to Alana for more direct action strategies. Over to you, Alana.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anjani. And it is extremely exciting to be here. I'm really glad that our relationships are bearing fruit. I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide, please, Sam. So we're on slide 2 now, right? Okay. Rights by themselves don't magically lead to change. One of the defining features of End Water Poverty is that our work is embedded in local actions to claim and realize these rights. In the end, as the UN Special Rapporteur says here, it is communities who are on the front line, engaging politicians, standing up to repressive police and corporate power, defending rivers, lakes, and groundwater. Community action, holding the line on their rights, fuels social change. After all of the global conferences and political commitments and nice words are said, it is the agency and actions of communities that activate legal policy frameworks and political promises. Slide 3, please. So who are we? Well, we at End Water Poverty, we center the rights to water and sanitation and intersectional rights in our work as a coalition. Realizing these rights is the only way to reduce structural inequality, which is a core feature of climate justice. As the slide says, we're a global coalition with over 150 different members in different countries, many of whom have joined us today, and it's really exciting to see you. Warm greetings, including, and our members includes community-based organizations, grassroots groups, national civil society organizations, and regional networks in Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the US, as well as trade unions and INGOs. We connect human rights advocates working in different parts of the world. We amplify community and activist voices, and we mobilize and support member organizations to advocate locally, nationally, regionally, globally for the rights to water and sanitation and a healthy environment. Next slide, please. Moving on to Claim Your Water Rights. So since it was launched on International Human Rights Day in 2019, Claim Your Water Rights has become a flagship campaign for End Water Poverty for a range of reasons. Its power is in the conviction that people directly affected by a lack of water and sanitation are best suited to design, develop, and deliver advocacy programs that are uniquely adapted to their local contexts or civic spaces. And so that's what the campaign does. We provide direct support in many grants with low entry barriers to pull together two members and pull together and exchange experience and knowledge about effective rights claiming strategies. There is an urgent need for us to expand our mini granting capacity. We've only been able to provide 31 grants so far, using about 82% of our operating budget, but it is extraordinary to see the impacts that members have achieved in difficult civic spaces and with very limited resources. The campaign has had far-reaching impacts at local and national levels, from achieving legal and policy reform in Pakistan to meaningfully influencing government's responses to COVID-19, exposing corporate water rights violations, and securing tangible improvements to services and infrastructure in hundreds of communities across the globe. Slide 5, please. So these are the various rights claiming strategies that our members employ. And what we're seeing, obviously, one really clear thing is community mobilization underpins many of these strategies, because in the end, it's communities that are on the front line. The success stories, and I'm sure Sam will share our progress report very soon. We're going to be publishing our 3 years of water rights claiming report, point to the efficacy of a combination of rights claiming strategies, of proactive, flexible, localized campaigns comprising both formal or invited and informal or invented rights claiming This diversity is crucial to the success of the campaign. My last slide is looking at 3 years of water rights claiming. This work takes agility, diversity, and tenacity. Community mobilization during the pandemic was difficult, and members employed creative strategies to address restrictions and repressions, disconnections, emergency water provisions, and utilized the heightened scrutiny, new public awareness that was placed on the water and sanitation sector, elections and media spotlights to great effect. The other point I'm going to pick up on is about governments. There's no question that governments are often unresponsive, corrupt, and repressive, but we cultivate government allies. We support community engagements with elected officials, dialogues between different government departments and between different levels of government. We use invited public participation and accountability mechanisms like petitions, complaints, letters, and parliamentary hearings. We also lobby behind doors, and our government allies use us to leak information that's critical to accountability. Government can be influential allies. Claim Your Water Rights aims to strengthen the accountability, credibility, and efficacy of government institutions. Just to go to the point of the intersection between climate and water justice. Climate and water are relatively new allies, but environmental justice activists, who I'm sure we have joined us on the call today, have been working on rights claiming for decades. Environmental litigation is advanced, and we have much to gain by partnering. The water and climate intersections bring into focus the need to combat extractive industries and corporate power, and they clearly reveal the power relations behind the struggle for safe, affordable, accessible water for everyone. Water is about politics, and we're working increasingly astutely with elections politics to claim water rights. We all know this. WASH budgets are decreased and increased as political tools. Cost recovery measures are introduced and dropped for political gain. In the end, water is a public good, and in a growing aquatic and economic crisis, safeguarding the rights of marginalized groups is more urgent now than ever. Members in Benin, India, Madagascar, Nigeria, Pakistan, South Africa, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and many others have encountered resistance and repression from their governments. The space for people to act, to express dissent, to hold accountability from public or private actors is too often met with the misuse of force. Activists across the world, and we think today of Thulani Maseko, are assassinated, are intimidated, are threatened, and subjected to strategic lawsuits, whether by their own governments or by extractive industries that prioritize profit over human rights and the environment, by the very same agencies that are destroying our planet. I'm going to end in a moment. Repression of protest is really only one form of repression. It is also repression when activists get no response from government officials to their water issues. It is also repression when they can't participate because they haven't got the right documentation or the information is published in a different language. It is also repression when wealthy consumers are prioritized over poor consumers, when water throttling starts in poor areas during times of water scarcity, when democratic participation is made impossible for marginalized people, and when affordable services are made difficult to access because of onerous registration requirements. Building allies and coalitions working on interrelated human rights fosters learning and solidarity and deepens our understanding of the different ways in which civil society confronts systemic injustice, power imbalances, and rights violations. Intersectionality can accelerate actions and multiply the scope and scale of campaigns. Indeed, this is why we are here today. Facilitating exchanges to deepen and strengthen tactics is core to our work this year. And so we're very excited about the discussion coming up. Thank you very much. Over to you, Anjani.
Thank you very much, Alana. That was a very moving and informative presentation. Thank you very much. And very sobering as well, particularly, as you say, in the news of the human rights defender Thulani Maseko. We are now going to go into the breakout rooms, and we ask you to please choose the breakout room according to your language and region, which will be showing up on the screen. All of the information that you need for the breakout session will be explained to you by the moderator of that session. Now, I think if you go to the I'm not quite sure, sorry, where it is to get into the breakout room. Yes, okay, thank you very much. I hope that everybody had the same experience that I did, which was a lot of very interesting and sometimes challenging discussions. A lot of different experiences are being spoken of. So we're going to go through all of the groups and hear back from what you have heard. I'm going to call on each of the rapporteurs. So I will start with Safia. Please, could you report back? I think you have a minute or two. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start off by please requesting our amazing group with Alana and I to look at the questions. The Jamboards will stay open and make your contributions to the questions that we just didn't get to because of time. Ours was a conversation around civil society efforts towards promoting washed rights and reclaiming those rights in different contexts, and also different government responses. And even though we had so many responses, they are very, very diverse. We've had allyship with government. We've had governments that promised very, very much but didn't deliver. And we discussed tactics around that. Using community-based grassroots activities was something that came up a lot as impactful. This change, this fight is on the ground. And what we're seeing is that networking is key to getting people engaged and bringing about change. What has worked as well is stratified interventions across the grassroots, regional and national levels, and solidarity with international spaces and learning from the lessons of other governments. There's also a need for sustained activism and constant capacity building to learn innovative new tactics in the efforts that are done. Something that was very inspiring to hear was in some countries, such as Zambia and Uganda, for example, there has been a multi-sectoral push and diverse involvement for change. Other countries, such as Zimbabwe and Malawi, need more work in those spaces. There have been efforts by community-based organizations that were promoted, such as in Singapore, for example, which promoted the UN Toilet Day that is now ratified by all 193 countries. We also discussed on the second slide, excuse me, what tactics have worked. Lobbying has worked, public-private partnerships have worked. There have been media allyships going across sectors and not just looking at this from a human rights perspective. Something that also emerged that needs further discussion, I think, is the anti-rights groups that are permeating these spaces, that come in the guise of rights organizations and promoting these efforts and yet undermine the actual work on the ground. There's so much more to say, but I'll leave it there. Last point was the impact and the allyship and solidarity that's built around storytelling as a tactic and a strategy to take forward. And I hope that's something we can explore in further course. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Safia. That sounds like a very interesting discussion, and you've made some very useful points there. And just to reiterate, please continue using the Jamboards. I'd like to now ask Jade to report back.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you, Safia. Some really interesting discussions in your room, as by the sounds of it, Safia, as was in ours. So we were in the Francophone Africa room, and to identify some kind of trends or risks and challenges, some very difficult relations with government, particularly around collaboration and repression, and often governments not understanding the function of civil society. There was also population complacency presented, which results in populations not necessarily supporting the work of civil society, and there could be some work done around perception of this, and then also capacity and resources of civil society being limited as a challenge. Some of the strategies or mechanisms through which the people in our room were working to expand civic spaces, working directly with parliamentarian networks around the human rights to water and sanitation, direct community awareness raising to combat the challenge of population complacency, advocacy for WASH to be made human rights more generally, and then declarations and statements from CSOs to highlight unethical practice. And then in terms of a couple of next steps, there was an interesting intervention from a colleague in Burundi who was asking we establish and strengthen regional solidarity to defend human rights advocates specifically, and also some conversation around youth, young people who make up such a huge proportion of the world population, not always being seen as serious interlocutors or partners, and proposal that could change or should change.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. Yes. Let's move straight on to Oriana. I just see the time is running from us. Oriana, could you report back from the Spanish-speaking countries?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. So basically, I feel like it's we've also had like similar conversations where everything revolved about like networking as being key to bring about change and solidarity and sustain activism, and like how, you know, like it's getting worse because of restricted civic spaces, and how then the shift has been on like strengthening like grassroots levels and capacity building and networkings and resources, because again, like these resources have been like limited. So they've also focused a lot on like peer exchange and like again, like networking and strengthening other ways via advocacy to promote like more efforts, and then like trying to look ways for more international visibility. But I feel like overall it's like underarching like thematics that we've all been discussing.
Thank you very much. So I think it just leaves it to me to wrap up. Firstly, a quick report back from the second Anglophone group. Much of what has been said, we heard in our discussions as well. And of course, in this very brief moment, we don't get the full richness of the experiences that people have shared with us. And I think even more than that, people have been working in this space for a long time. And so one of the things that was reflected in our group was also a bit of a wave of sometimes the civic space is smaller, and then you get a new government and there's more space, and a little bit of a conversation about how that space can be expanded. And I think that one point was that civil society organizations don't just use one strategy. They're not just challenging government. They're also trying to build bridges and work together with government, and working at different levels in government, and sharing that process. And I think that also that we also had a discussion on how there can be international solidarity. So where development partners recognize that in a country there is a closing of civic space, they have provided extra funding specifically for advocacy. And I think that in the water and sanitation sector, that's one area that we often miss. It's often thinking that, you know, what we need is hardware and services, but actually a lot of what we need is this opportunity to advocate, to lobby, to open the civic space in order for communities to really communicate what it is that they need. I hope that that small reflection from our group discussion will suffice for the group that I was listening to this afternoon. So I think that all that is left for me now is to say thank you very much. This has been an amazing conversation. I think from the SWA perspective, it has really accentuated how important it is to sanitation and water for all. And there it is in the name. We're talking about water and sanitation, but we have to talk about much more. We have to talk about everything that is concerning civil society in order to improve what we have identified as our mandate, which is water and sanitation. It cannot be done without engaging civil society on all of the issues that matter to them. So I think that this is a fantastic partnership together with End Water Poverty and Civicus. I hope that we will continue to work on these issues together and continue to look for ways of collaborating. I hope that you've taken note of people's names and their organizations. You know who you can contact in order to further continue the discussions. I know I've taken some notes of names of people that I really want to hear more from. There will obviously be, all of the presentations will be shared with the people who have participated today. And as far as possible, contacts, I hope you will approach us. If there's somebody that you can't actually access, then we will maybe be able to help you to contact each other. That's an important part of what all of our organizations do as network organizations. Of course, a huge thank you to the organizers of this session, End Water Poverty, the Sanitation and Water for All team who were working on this, and Civicus. And last but absolutely not least, to the interpretation team and the people who start sitting behind the scenes, making sure that we can talk to each other in this way. Thank you very much. It's 1 minute past the hour, so 1 minute past, half past, I should say, and it's time to stop. Thank you so much.